Kon Tum Province, South Vietnam. On the evening of November 19, 1967, a Marine Corps pilot named Richard Tabor banked his A-4 Skyhawk over a hill his own side had spent all day fighting for, and released 2 bombs into the middle of it. He did not do it out of malice, and he did not do it by choice, in any meaningful sense. The men below him were dug into a hillside so thick with jungle that no one flying above it could reliably tell where the American perimeter ended and the North Vietnamese trenches began. Somewhere in the confusion of that afternoon, the coordinates radioed up to his aircraft placed his target squarely on top of his own side's wounded, and their medics, and the 2 command posts trying to hold what was left of the position together. 42 men were killed in the seconds that followed. Another 45 were wounded, some of them for the 2nd or 3rd time that day. Among the dead was an army chaplain who had already spent the afternoon walking, unarmed, back and forth across open ground to carry wounded paratroopers to safety on his own shoulders. By the time the sun rose again the next morning, the battalion that had climbed that hill less than 24 hours earlier was no longer capable of continuing the fight on its own. It would take 2 more days, another full battalion, and a coordinated attack from a second direction entirely before American and South Vietnamese forces finally controlled the ground they had first set out to take on a quiet Sunday morning that already felt, by the time it ended, like it belonged to a different war entirely. This is the story of how those men came to be on that hill in the first place, 4 days before Thanksgiving, 1967, in a fight the United States Army officially called a great victory, and that the general who succeeded its architect would later call, in blunter language, a fight over a piece of ground with no strategic value at all. 3 men in particular sit at the heart of what happened here, and this documentary is going to introduce you to each of them before it explains anything else, before the units, the dates, the strategy, or the arguments historians have had about this battle ever since. Their stories are worth knowing on their own terms first. This is the story of Dak To, and the ridge its survivors would remember simply as Hill 875. This documentary is going to move slowly through what follows, the way it has tried to move slowly through every battle it has told before this one, because these are not stories that benefit from being rushed. 3 men are at the center of this story, and before this documentary explains how the battle began, who ordered it, and what the North Vietnamese army was defending on that hillside, it is worth spending time with each of them, as people rather than as names on a casualty list. The first of the 3 was not, in any conventional sense, a soldier at all. Charles Joseph Waters was born on January 17, 1927, in Jersey City, New Jersey. He attended Seton Hall Preparatory School and then Seton Hall University, and from an early age his path pointed toward the priesthood rather than the military. He was ordained a Catholic priest for the Archdiocese of Newark in 1953, and for more than a decade afterward, he served as a parish priest in a string of New Jersey communities: Jersey City, Rutherford, Paramus, Cranford. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, a quiet and devoted parish priest, the kind of man whose life seemed to be settling into a long, steady rhythm of small-town ministry. He had also, somewhat unusually for a parish priest of that era, earned his private pilot's license, a detail that speaks to a restless, adventurous streak underneath the collar. Those who served alongside him in Vietnam would later describe a man who did not stay behind the lines the way a chaplain, by the ordinary logic of army organization, might have been expected to. An army chaplain's job, on paper, involves a great deal of time spent well away from active combat, religious services, counseling, letters home, the quieter administrative work of tending to a unit's spiritual welfare between operations. Waters treated that description as a floor, not a ceiling. He was known, even before November of 1967, for moving forward with combat patrols rather than waiting at a firebase for the wounded to be brought back to him, a habit that unsettled some of the officers around him and earned him a quiet, particular respect among the enlisted paratroopers who noticed exactly where their chaplain chose to stand. Colleagues from his parish years described him as unassuming almost to a fault, a man more comfortable listening than speaking about himself, which makes the relative scarcity of personal writings or interviews from Waters himself, compared to some other figures in this documentary, feel consistent with how he apparently moved through the world generally. Present, attentive, and rarely at the center of attention by his own choosing, right up until the day circumstances placed him there permanently. In 1962, at the age of 35, Waters joined the New Jersey Air National Guard as a chaplain. 2 years later, he transferred to active Army duty. His first tour in Vietnam began on July 5, 1966, and he served with the same brigade whose story this documentary is telling, the 173rd Airborne. He was present for Operation Junction City in February of 1967, one of the largest American airborne operations of the entire war, and he earned an Air Medal and a Bronze Star for Valor during that operation, for conduct that, by every account, put him repeatedly in the same danger as the paratroopers he ministered to. By the middle of 1967, Waters had completed his standard tour of duty. He was not required to stay in Vietnam a single day longer. He extended his service voluntarily in July of that year, choosing 6 more months in a war zone over a return to the quiet parish life waiting for him at home. It is worth sitting with that choice for a moment, because it is the choice that placed him on Hill 875 on November 19, 1967, a fight he had no military obligation to be anywhere near. There is a broader context worth understanding here about what military chaplains were, and were not, expected to do in Vietnam. Chaplains served unarmed by long-standing tradition and, in many cases, by the Geneva Conventions themselves, a protected status that assumed they would remain near, but not directly inside, active combat. That assumption held reasonably well in a conventional battle line. In the kind of fragmented close-range jungle fighting the 173rd Airborne faced at Hill 875, where the front line itself barely existed as a fixed thing and wounded men could be scattered across 100 meters of contested ground, a chaplain, who took that protected status literally, staying safely to the rear, would have been of very little practical use to the men who actually needed him. Waters had apparently made his own peace with that tension long before November 19th ever arrived. His actions that day are described, in the language of his eventual Medal of Honor citation, with a kind of restrained precision that undersells what they actually meant on the ground. Attached to Company A of the 173rd Support Battalion, Waters moved with the forward assault elements as they pushed up the hill that morning. When the lead company was thrown back down the slope under heavy fire, Waters did not retreat with the main body of the unit. He moved forward, alone and unarmed, back through the fighting to find wounded paratroopers who had been left behind in the initial withdrawal. The citation records that he did this not once, but 3 separate times, each trip carrying him back into small arms fire, automatic weapons fire, and mortar fire that had already driven trained infantry off that same ground. On at least one of those trips, he carried a wounded paratrooper out on his own shoulders, the physical image of a 50-year-old parish priest hauling a wounded soldier down a fire-swept hillside because no one else was in position to do it. Consider what that morning and afternoon must have actually looked like, in practical terms, for a man carrying no weapon of his own. Every trip back down that slope meant walking, on foot, into ground that trained infantrymen with rifles and radios were actively retreating away from. There was no cover being offered to him, no special dispensation from the machine gun fire and the mortar rounds simply because the man moving through it wore a cross instead of carrying a weapon. He made the choice each time regardless, 3 separate trips by the citation's own count, and there is no way to know now whether he counted them himself or simply kept going back until there was no one left to bring out. He continued this work through the rest of the day and into the evening, moving among the wounded, offering aid and last rites without any apparent regard for his own safety, in a perimeter that was, by nightfall, barely holding together at all. It was in the middle of that work, tending to the wounded gathered near the consolidated command post, that the friendly firebombs described at the top of this documentary landed. Charles Waters was killed instantly, 40 years old, in the closing hours of a 6-month extension he had chosen entirely on his own. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His name appears on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington on Panel 30E, Row 036. In New Jersey, a bridge over the Passaic River, connecting Clifton and Rutherford, carries his name today, along with a public school in Jersey City, the same city where he was born. He remains, to this day, one of only a small handful of military chaplains in American history to receive the Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously for a death that came not from firing a weapon, but from refusing, 3 times over, to leave anyone behind. It is worth pausing before this documentary moves on to the next of the 3 men at the center of this story, to notice what kind of courage his was, specifically. Every other Medal of Honor recipient from this battle earned that recognition through some form of direct combat action: a machine gun held against an advancing enemy, a grenade absorbed to save the men nearby. Waters never fired a shot. His entire record of valor consists of walking, again and again, into the same ground other men were fighting to get out of, carrying nothing but the conviction that no wounded paratrooper on that hillside was going to be left there alone. The second man this story keeps returning to was, on the same afternoon, Charles Waters spent carrying wounded men down a hillside, holding a machine gun at the very edge of the same fight, buying the time that let anyone escape at all. Carlos James Lozada was born on September 6, 1946, in Caguas, Puerto Rico, a city in the island's central mountains, a landscape of its own steep green ridges, not entirely unlike the terrain that would eventually take his life on the other side of the world. He finished high school in 1966, and shortly afterward, still a very young man, he married. Not long after the wedding, he enlisted in the United States Army. It was, in the pattern common to so many young men of his generation, a decision made in the earliest, most hopeful stretch of adult life, a new marriage barely settled before the machinery of a war on the other side of the planet began pulling at it. By June 11, 1967, he was in Vietnam, a private first class assigned to the 1st Platoon, Company A, 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, the same battalion whose story sits at the center of this documentary. He had been in the country barely 5 months by the time Hill 875 came into view. He was, by the time of the assault, still one of the newer men in his platoon, having joined the unit only months earlier, which makes the composure he showed at that outpost that afternoon all the more striking. Veteran soldiers sometimes speak of a kind of battlefield instinct that only develops after months of sustained combat exposure, a calm born of repetition. Lozada had not yet had time to build that kind of experience. What he had, in the moment his outpost was struck, was something else entirely, a clarity about what his position required of him that did not depend on how long he had already served. On the afternoon of November 19th, as the lead companies of that assault pushed toward the crest of Hill 875, Lozada's unit, Company A, was held in a trailing position, providing rear security for the 2 companies ahead of them. At around 2:30 that afternoon, the North Vietnamese Army's 2nd Battalion, 174th Regiment, launched a heavy, well-coordinated counterattack directly against Company A's position, catching the Americans from a direction no one had fully anticipated. Lozada was manning a 4-man early warning outpost, roughly 35 meters in front of his company's main line, close enough to the jungle tree line to give the unit behind him a few extra seconds of warning if the enemy approached. Those seconds mattered more than anyone could have predicted. When the North Vietnamese company came forward, Lozada opened fire with his M60 machine gun at a range of only about 10 meters, close enough that there was no margin for hesitation on either side. His gun alone is credited with killing at least 20 enemy soldiers in those opening moments, breaking the momentum of the assault before it could fully develop. As the weight of the attack continued to build, Company A's commander gave the order to withdraw down the slope, consolidating with the rest of the battalion. Every other man at that outpost pulled back. Lozada did not. He stayed at his exposed position, alone, continuing to fire, because pulling his gun out of the fight, even for the time it would have taken to relocate, it would have opened a gap the retreating company could not have survived crossing. He held that ground and kept firing until he was mortally wounded at his gun. Think for a moment about the geometry of what actually happened at that outpost. A 4-man position, 35 meters ahead of the main line, exists to buy warning time, not to hold ground against a determined attack. The expectation, built into the very design of an early warning post, is that the men manning it fire a few bursts, confirm the enemy's direction and strength, and fall back to the main body before they are overrun. 3 of the 4 men at that outpost did exactly what the position was designed for. Lozada recognized in the middle of the attack that the position's actual job in that specific moment had changed. The company behind him needed more than warning, it needed time, and the only way to manufacture more time was for someone to stay at the gun after the position's official purpose had already been served. He was 21 years old. He left behind the wife he had married only a year and a half earlier. His Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously in December of 1969, more than 2 years after his death, one of only 5 Puerto Rican-born soldiers to receive the Medal of Honor for actions during the Vietnam War. He is buried at Long Island National Cemetery in Farmingdale, New York, far from the mountains of Caguas where he grew up. It took more than 2 years for that recognition to arrive, a gap not unusual for Medal of Honor recommendations from this period of the war, when paperwork for the nation's highest military honor moved through multiple layers of review, verification, and approval before a final decision was made. For Lozada's widow, those 2 years meant living with the knowledge of what her husband had done and how he had died, long before the nation offered any formal acknowledgement of it at all, an ordinary and largely invisible kind of waiting that fell to the families of nearly every posthumous Medal of Honor recipient from this war, including the other men whose stories this documentary has already told. His name has been carried forward in a scattering of places since. A playground in the Bronx bears his name, as does a fitness center at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 101st Airborne Division. In November of 2008, more than 40 years after his death, a portrait of Carlos Lozada was unveiled in the rotunda of Puerto Rico's own Capitol building, a young machine gunner from Caguas, formally taking his place among the island's own honored dead. What the record cannot fully capture is the particular arithmetic of what he did that afternoon. A decision, made alone, in perhaps a few seconds, to trade the rest of his own life for the handful of seconds his company needed to get off that slope alive. Charles Waters spent that same day trying to make sure no wounded man was left behind. Carlos Lozada spent it making sure there were fewer wounded men to begin with, at the only cost that could have bought that outcome. The third man. This documentary wants you to know before the chronology properly begins was not on Hill 875 at all. His story belongs to an earlier, separate action within the same larger battle, 8 days before Hill 875 became a name anyone had heard of, and this documentary will be careful, throughout, to keep that distinction clear rather than letting two different fights blur into one convenient story. John Andrew Barnes III was born on April 16, 1945, in Boston, Massachusetts, and was known to his family as Jackie. He was adopted at the age of 2, a quieter and more private kind of arrangement than adoption often is today, and folded simply and completely into a Massachusetts family that would, in the end, spend the rest of its life mourning him as fully their own. His family later moved from Belmont to Dedham, the town he would come to call home. By his sister's later description, he was an average student, quiet and shy by nature, but very dedicated and very patriotic underneath that quietness. He was a member of the Civil Air Patrol in high school, the kind of structured, service-minded activity that often marks a young person already oriented toward military life before they ever enlist. By the time Barnes reached Vietnam, he already carried more combat experience than most soldiers his age. Before Vietnam, Barnes served during the American intervention in the Dominican Republic in 1965 and 1966, spending roughly a year stationed in Santo Domingo during that conflict, a smaller and today largely forgotten deployment that nonetheless meant he arrived in Southeast Asia as someone who already understood, in a way many of his fellow paratroopers did not yet, what it actually felt like to be shot at. His first tour in Vietnam began on May 31, 1966. He could have gone home after that tour ended. Instead, in the fall of 1967, he volunteered for a second tour, a decision that, by his family's account, distressed his mother considerably. It is a choice that echoes, in its own way, the extension Chaplain Waters made that same year, a man who had already done his part choosing, deliberately, to go back. Barnes was a private first class serving with Company C, 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry, when his unit was ambushed on November 11, 1967, part of what the Army called Task Force Black, days before the fighting shifted to the hill that would become the battle's most famous chapter. When his machine gun crew was killed in the opening moments of the ambush, Barnes moved to the gun himself and kept firing, credited afterward with 9 confirmed kills covering his unit's position. At some point in the fighting, he moved out to retrieve more ammunition for the gun. It was in that moment that he saw a grenade land in the middle of a group of wounded American soldiers. He threw himself onto it. There is something worth noting in the shape of that final decision, distinct from the courage itself. Barnes had, by that point in the fight, already done everything that would ordinarily have marked him as the hero of the engagement, taken over a machine gun after its crew was killed, held a position, accounted for 9 confirmed enemy dead. He did not have to go back out for more ammunition at all, and having gone, he did not have to place himself between a live grenade and men he had, by then, already done more than his share to protect. He made that second choice anyway, on top of the first. What makes Barnes's story worth telling in more than its bare facts is what happened afterward, inside his own chain of command. His battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel David Schumacher, initially declined to endorse the Medal of Honor recommendation written up for him. By one account, Schumacher's objection was blunt. He did not believe medals should be given to men who had, in his words, committed suicide. The recommendation went forward regardless, and Barnes received the Medal of Honor posthumously, presented at a ceremony attended by Vice President Spiro Agnew at the same ceremony where Charles Waters was also honored. Schumacher's reported objection deserves a moment of real consideration rather than simple dismissal, uncomfortable as it is. It reflects a genuine, if bluntly stated, tension that has followed the Medal of Honor throughout its history. Whether an act that ends in near certain death, however heroic in effect, should be honored in exactly the same way as extraordinary courage that leaves a soldier alive to keep fighting. It is not a question this documentary intends to resolve. What can be said plainly is that the recommendation went forward over that initial objection, that the review process above Schumacher's own level judged Barnes's actions to meet the standard regardless, and that the medal was, in the end, awarded. Barnes was 22 years old. Dedham, Massachusetts renamed its memorial field in his honor in 1970, and it remains John A. Barnes III Memorial Park today. A Navy building in Boston was renamed for him in 1997. Local scholarship programs carrying his name have continued into the present day, more than half a century after his death, in the town that watched a quiet, average student grow into a man who volunteered for a war twice. His story sits slightly outside the frame of everything that follows in this documentary, chronologically and geographically, fought on a different piece of ground 8 days before the assault on Hill 875 even began. But it belongs to the same 3-week battle, the same brigade, the same command decisions about how hard to press an enemy dug into these particular mountains, and it is worth knowing before this documentary turns, properly, to how that larger battle began. To understand how 3 men like these ended up on the same stretch of jungle in November of 1967, it helps to step back and look at the pattern their battle was part of, a pattern that historians only fully recognized after the fact. By late 1967, the United States had well over 400,000 troops stationed in South Vietnam, a commitment that had grown steadily and dramatically since the first large-scale deployment of American combat units in 1965. The war, by that point, had already produced tens of thousands of American deaths, and public opinion at home, while still broadly supportive of the war effort, had begun to show real cracks that debates over exactly this kind of battle, fought at real cost over ground of uncertain value, would only widen in the months ahead. In the second half of 1967, the North Vietnamese army mounted a string of unusually large, unusually conventional battles, all of them fought far from South Vietnam's cities and population centers, and all of them clustered along the remote frontier with Cambodia and Laos. There was Con Thien in September, Loc Ninh at the very end of October, Song Bi, and beginning on November 3rd, Dak To in the central highlands of Kon Tum province, close enough to the Cambodian border that reinforcement and resupply for the enemy were never more than a short march away. Historians would later group these together under a single label, the border battles. The standard explanation for why North Vietnam chose to fight this way, offered by many historians after the fact, is that these battles were a deliberate diversion intended to pull American combat units out of the populated lowlands and cities and up into the remote highlands, thinning American coverage everywhere else in the country ahead of a much larger operation still to come. By January of 1968, roughly half of all American combat battalions in South Vietnam had indeed been drawn into these border regions. 2 months after Dak To ended, on the night of January 30th, 1968, that larger operation arrived, a coordinated countrywide offensive striking dozens of cities and towns simultaneously, timed to the Tet Lunar New Year holiday. It is worth being honest, though, about how settled that explanation actually is. Some of the framing linking Dak To directly to a deliberate Tet diversion appears to have been assigned only in hindsight, after Tet had already happened, and historians went looking for the pattern that explained it. Captured North Vietnamese documents and prisoners from the Dak To fighting itself described a different, more immediate objective: destroying an American brigade-sized unit outright and seizing the town of Dak To for its own sake, not luring anyone anywhere. Both readings appear in the historical record, and this documentary will not pretend the question is closed. What can be said is that whether or not it was planned that way from the start, the effect was the same. American attention and American infantry were, in November of 1967, fixed on a remote mountain range 2 months before the war changed shape entirely. There is a striking timing detail worth setting alongside all of this. In the very same month the fighting at Dak To was underway, General Westmoreland traveled back to Washington to address Congress and the National Press Club, delivering what became one of the most quoted speeches of the entire war, an optimistic assessment arguing that American forces had reached a turning point, that the end of the war was, in his words, coming into view. He gave that speech while American paratroopers were still fighting and dying on a hillside most of the country had never heard of, a hillside that would, within days, produce one of the costliest single actions any American brigade fought in the entire war. The contrast between the confidence delivered in Washington and the reality unfolding in the mountains of Kon Tum province is not something later historians invented for effect. It happened at the same time, to the same war, and it is worth sitting with before this documentary moves any further into the battle itself. There is a specific historical echo worth noting here as well. At the time, some officers on General William Westmoreland's own staff privately compared what was happening at Dak To to a much older pattern, the peripheral campaigns the Viet Minh had waged against the French in the early 1950s, campaigns that had culminated in the Siege of Dien Phu in 1954, the battle that ended French colonial rule in Vietnam for good. Within weeks of Dak To's conclusion, a new and much larger siege began at a base called Khe San, surrounded by what would eventually be as many as 3 full North Vietnamese divisions. To the officers watching it unfold, the pattern seemed to be repeating itself in real time. The North Vietnamese force committed to Dak To belonged to the 1st Division of the People's Army of Vietnam, operating under the broader Western Highlands Command known as the B-3 Front, roughly 6,000 to 7,000 troops organized into 4 regiments. The 66th Regiment formed the main attacking force southwest of the town. The 32nd Regiment held blocking positions to the south, ready to intercept any American counterattack. The 24th Regiment covered the northeast, positioned to prevent reinforcements from reaching the fight, a regiment that, notably, would go on to take part in the Tet Offensive itself 2 months later. And in reserve to the northwest sat the 174th Regiment, the unit that would eventually dig into the bunkers and trenches of Hill 875 and hold them against everything the 173rd Airborne could throw at the position. It is worth understanding, too, why these particular regiments were positioned exactly where they were, because the arrangement reflects real tactical thinking rather than a simple wall of troops. Placing the 32nd and 24th Regiments in blocking positions to the south and northeast meant that any American attempt to reinforce quickly or to encircle the main attacking force would run into prepared defenses before it ever reached the fight itself. Holding the 174th Regiment in reserve to the northwest, on ground that would eventually become Hill 875, meant the North Vietnamese command retained a substantial, fresh striking force that had not yet been engaged, ready to commit wherever the battle demanded it most. That reserve force, still largely intact and well dug in, was exactly what the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, would walk into on the morning of November 19th. On the American side, overall responsibility for the Central Highlands rested with a corps-level headquarters called 1st Field Force, Vietnam, based well to the east at Nha Trang. The division actually stationed in the area, the 4th Infantry Division, was commanded by Major General William Pears, and it was Pears's division, reinforced heavily by an elite airborne brigade flown in for the fight, that would carry the weight of the battle to come. Pears himself was, in his own right, a highly experienced officer by 1967, with a career stretching back to service in Burma during the Second World War, commanding irregular forces behind Japanese lines, in terrain not entirely unlike the mountains he now found himself fighting through again, more than 2 decades later, against a very different enemy. There is a strange footnote to Piers's own career worth mentioning here, one this documentary will return to only briefly, much later. 2 years after Dak To, the same general who declared this battle a clear American victory would be appointed to lead the official investigation into the cover-up of the My Lai massacre, a case that would come to define a very different and far darker chapter of the same war. There is one further wrinkle in the American chain of command worth clarifying here, because it is easy to get wrong. Some accounts of this period refer to an American headquarters called Task Force Alpha, as though it were an active command during the November fighting. It was not. Task Force Alpha was an earlier 1965-era name for the Provisional Corps Command that had, by 1966, been formally reorganized and renamed I Field Force Vietnam, the same headquarters already described above. By November of 1967, Task Force Alpha no longer existed as an active organization under that name. The task forces genuinely operating at Dak To that November carried different names entirely, built at the battalion level rather than the corps level. And this documentary will introduce them properly when the fighting itself begins. None of this, in November of 1967, was yet visible to the young paratroopers boarding helicopters at Dak To's airstrip. To them, this was simply the next mission, in a war that had already been going on, by that point, for the better part of 2.5 years of major American combat involvement. What none of them could have known was that the mountains they were about to climb into were, whether by design or by consequence, about to become one of the bloodiest single battles of the entire American war in Vietnam. Con Tum Province, South Vietnam. Dak To sat in the far northwestern corner of South Vietnam's central highlands, a region of steep, forested mountains running along the borders with Laos and Cambodia. Terrain that had made it, for the entire war, one of the hardest stretches of the country for either side to fully control. The town itself was small, little more than a district capital and a dirt airstrip, but its location made it strategically important out of proportion to its size. It sat astride routes the North Vietnamese army used to move troops and supplies out of Laos and Cambodia and into the populated coastal regions of central South Vietnam, part of the same broader logistics network that ran through the A Shau Valley farther north and fed the North Vietnamese war effort across the entire central part of the country. The terrain itself was, by nearly every account from the men who fought there, some of the most punishing ground of the entire war. Ridgelines rose sharply out of narrow valleys, covered in double and triple canopy jungle, so dense that direct sunlight rarely reached the forest floor. Movement was slow and exhausting, even without an enemy contesting it, a matter of hacking through undergrowth one step at a time, climbing slopes steep enough that soldiers sometimes had to pull themselves up by roots and vines. Visibility on the ground was often measured in single-digit meters. A unit could walk within a few paces of a fortified enemy bunker complex and see nothing at all until the first shots were fired. American infantry units, by contrast, had to relearn this terrain's particular demands essentially from scratch every time a new unit rotated into the area, since so much of what mattered here could not be taught from a manual. Water discipline mattered enormously in heat and humidity that could exhaust a soldier carrying a full combat load within hours. Foot care mattered in ground that stayed damp for days after even a brief rain. And perhaps most of all, patience mattered, since the terrain itself punished any unit that tried to move too quickly through it, whether that unit was chasing a retreating enemy or simply trying to reach its own objective on schedule. The North Vietnamese army had spent a long time preparing that ground before November of 1967 ever arrived. The bunker and trench complexes American units encountered throughout the battle, and especially on Hill 875 itself, were not hastily dug positions thrown up in response to an incoming attack. They were deep, log-reinforced fighting positions, connected by tunnels and covered trenches, built to withstand direct artillery hits and to let defenders disappear underground during airstrikes and reappear the moment American infantry got close enough to assault. American engineers and infantry alike quickly learned to respect just how effective this construction really was. Standard high-explosive artillery shells, even fired in significant numbers, frequently failed to collapse the heaviest of these bunkers outright, meaning that many positions had to be cleared the hard way, at close range, by soldiers advancing under fire to finish what the artillery preparation had only begun. One historian who studied the battle afterward described the defenses as layered one upon another, separated by intervals of a kilometer or more, so that even a successful assault on one ring of bunkers left an attacking force facing another ring immediately behind it. For the Montagnard peoples native to these highlands, this same terrain had been home for generations, farmed in small clearings and navigated along trails invisible to anyone who had not grown up walking them. For the young Americans and South Vietnamese soldiers arriving by helicopter in November of 1967, most of them had never seen anything like it before in their lives. Mountains that seemed to swallow sound, a canopy so complete that a man could become disoriented within a few dozen meters of his own unit, and an enemy who had lived and fought in exactly this landscape for years already, while the soldiers now climbing into it were, in most cases, encountering triple canopy jungle warfare for the very first time. Weather added its own difficulty. November sits at the tail end of the region's rainy season, and low cloud and mist could ground the helicopters both sides depended on for movement and resupply for hours or days at a stretch. For an American force whose entire way of fighting relied on being able to fly troops, artillery, and supplies wherever the battle demanded, weather delays of even a single day could change the character of a fight already balanced on a knife's edge. At the center of this stretch of country sat a small American Special Forces installation, officially designated Camp A-244, though its exact footprint had already shifted more than once by 1967. It had originally been established some distance away under the name Dak To, before being relocated to the vicinity of Dak To itself, and it would move again in January of 1968 to a nearby outpost called Ben Het, before the original Dak To camp closed altogether the following May. Camps like this one were never large by the standards of a conventional army base. A handful of American Special Forces soldiers, a much larger contingent of Montagnard irregulars serving as CIDG fighters, a short dirt airstrip, and a perimeter built to survive being the most exposed American position in the entire region. It was exactly this kind of small forward outpost, sitting closest to the border and closest to the mountains the North Vietnamese army had spent months preparing, that would end up feeling the very first tremors of the larger battle building around it. Life at a camp like this one moved to its own particular rhythm, shaped entirely by the isolation of the place. Supplies arrived by air or by the occasional armed convoy along roads the enemy could interdict at will. News from the outside world came slowly, if it came at all. The men stationed there, American and Montagnard alike, learned to read the surrounding hills the way sailors learn to read weather, watching for the small signs, a column of smoke in the wrong place, a patrol that returned early. That meant something in the jungle beyond the wire had changed. It was into this terrain, in the first days of November 1967, that a Special Forces camp near Dak To itself, and the American infantry units sent to reinforce it, first began to sense that something larger than routine patrol activity was building in the mountains around them. The force the United States eventually committed to Dak To grew, over the course of 3 weeks, into something considerably larger than anyone expected when the fighting first opened, and it is worth laying out clearly who was actually there, because the units involved are easy to confuse with each other, and this documentary would rather be precise than convenient. At the core was the 4th Infantry Division, under Major General William Pears, already stationed in the area as part of an ongoing, much longer operation called Operation MacArthur, which had begun the previous month and would continue for more than a year after Dak To itself was over. Pears's 1st Brigade, under Colonel Richard Johnson, moved its headquarters to Dak To as the fighting intensified, bringing with it the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 12th Infantry Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel John Vollmer, along with the 3rd Battalion of the 8th Infantry and elements of the 8th Infantry's mechanized battalions under Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Belknap. Roughly 15 artillery batteries eventually supported the fight from fire bases scattered through the surrounding hills. Coordination between the 4th Infantry Division and the newly arrived 173rd Airborne was itself a non-trivial undertaking. The two commands had not trained together, did not share a long operational history in this particular stretch of terrain, and now had to mesh their radio procedures, fire support requests, and battlefield boundaries within days of the brigade's arrival, under the pressure of an already escalating fight. Reinforcing the 4th Infantry Division was the 173rd Airborne Brigade, flown in under Brigadier General Leo Schweiter, and it was this brigade, more than any other single unit, that would carry the fight for Hill 875 and absorb its heaviest cost. The brigade's 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, under Major James Steverson, was the unit that assaulted the hill directly, though because Steverson coordinated much of the fight from a support position, tactical command of the forward companies on the ground, on the day the assault began, fell to Captain Harold Kaufman. The brigade's 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry, under Lieutenant Colonel James H. Johnson, would become the relief force that fought its way up the same slope days later to reach the men Kaufman had led into it. 2 additional battalions, the 1st Battalion of the 12th Cavalry Regiment and the 2nd Battalion of the 8th Cavalry Regiment, reinforced the fight as well, and this is the point in the order of battle where confusion tends to creep in, so it is worth stating plainly. These cavalry units belonged to the 1st Cavalry Division, an entirely separate division from the 4th Infantry Division, even though the 4th Infantry Division's own regiments happened to carry the similar-sounding numbers 8 and 12. An 8th Cavalry Battalion and an 8th Infantry Battalion at Dak To were not the same unit, did not share a chain of command, and should not be treated as interchangeable, however similar their names look on paper. It is worth pausing on the 173rd Airborne Brigade's own identity for a moment, because it shapes everything that follows in this documentary. The brigade traced its lineage back to a unit first activated in the Pacific during the Second World War, and by 1967 it had already built a reputation, inside and outside the Army, as one of the most aggressively used combat formations in Vietnam, a brigade that moved from operation to operation across the country, rather than holding a single fixed area of responsibility the way most divisions did. Being flown in to reinforce the 4th Infantry Division at Dak To was, for the 173rd, simply the latest in a long string of such deployments. What none of its paratroopers could have known, boarding transport aircraft in the last days of October, was that this particular deployment was about to become the single costliest few days of fighting the brigade would face anywhere in the entire war. South Vietnam's own army committed substantial forces as well. The 42nd Infantry Regiment, 4 battalions strong, alongside elite ARVN airborne battalions and ranger elements, fighting some of the war's hardest close-quarters engagements of the entire battle on positions like Hill 1416, at a cost that would run into the hundreds of ARVN casualties before the fighting ended. Coordinating a fight of this size also meant an enormous logistical effort operating quietly behind Every combat unit this documentary has named so far. Supply clerks tracking ammunition consumption across a dozen fire bases, medical evacuation crews flying repeated missions into landing zones still under fire, artillery fire direction centers calculating hundreds of individual missions a day, and radio operators relaying reports up and down a chain of command stretched across 3 separate divisions and an allied army. None of these men and women, if this documentary is honest, will ever appear by name in most retellings of this battle, and yet the battle could not have been fought the way it was fought without every one of them doing their own less visible job correctly, hour after hour, for 3 straight weeks. It is worth remembering, amid all of these unit designations and command relationships, that every one of these battalions was made up overwhelmingly of very young men, many of them draftees rather than volunteers, commanded in the field by officers not far removed in age from the soldiers under them. A rifle company at full strength in 1967 might carry 150 or more men on its rolls, but the actual number available for a given assault, after accounting for men on leave, men recovering from earlier wounds, and men held back for other duties, was often considerably smaller. The 3 companies that assaulted Hill 875 on November 19th numbered roughly 330 men combined, a figure that, once losses began mounting, would shrink with brutal speed. And at the center of it all, geographically, if not always tactically, sat a special forces camp near Dak To itself, garrisoned by a detachment of the 5th Special Forces Group working alongside Montagnard irregulars, recruited from the Highland tribes native to the region. These CIDG fighters served, among other things, as guides for the American infantry columns pushing out from the camp in the war's opening days, men who knew this terrain in a way no unit flown in from elsewhere ever fully could. Command relationships in a battle this size were never perfectly clean in practice. Units from 3 different American divisions, an entire South Vietnamese regiment, elite ARVN airborne, and ranger battalions, and special forces-led irregulars were all, within a matter of days, operating across the same 20 or so square kilometers of mountainous jungle, coordinating artillery fire, airstrikes, and helicopter movements across unit boundaries that had never been designed with this many separate commands in mind. Radio frequencies had to be deconflicted. Fire support coordination lines had to be redrawn daily as units advanced or fell back. It was, in the driest military language, a complex battle to command. In practice, as this documentary will describe later, that complexity carried a real and repeated human cost, in the form of friendly fire incidents that struck American units more than once before the fighting was over. On the other side of the wire, the 1st Division of the North Vietnamese Army held the high ground, commanded in the field by Nguyen Thanh Son at the regimental level, over troops who had, in many cases, spent months preparing the exact bunker complexes the Americans and South Vietnamese were now marching toward. Both sides, in the first days of November 1967, were committing more force to this stretch of mountains than either had originally planned, and neither yet knew how large the fight was about to become. In the first days of November 1967, American command still had only a partial picture of what was gathering in the mountains around Dak To, and much of what they did know came from a single man who had, only days earlier, been fighting for the other side. Around the 2nd or 3rd of November, a North Vietnamese Army sergeant named Vu Hong crossed over to American lines and surrendered. War, for a defector, is rarely a simple or single decision. Crossing lines in the middle of an active conflict zone meant risking death from either side, from the army being left behind, or from the one being approached, in terrain where a man moving alone could easily be mistaken for a scout or an infiltrator, rather than someone seeking to surrender. Whatever specific circumstances led Vu Hong to make that crossing, the risk itself was real. Defections of this kind were not unheard of over the course of the war, but the timing and the detail of what Sergeant Vu Hong provided made this one unusually consequential. He gave American intelligence officers accurate, current information on North Vietnamese troop dispositions in the hills surrounding Dak To and on the intentions behind them. It was, by several accounts, this single defector's information, more than any other source, that first confirmed to American command that they were facing something considerably larger than routine enemy activity in the area, a multi-regiment force preparing for a sustained fight rather than a scattering of local guerrilla units. What Vu Hong's information could not fully capture was the scale of the preparation already underway. The North Vietnamese army had spent a considerable amount of time turning the mountains around Dak To into a defensive network built to absorb exactly the kind of assault the Americans were about to launch. Bunkers were dug deep into hillsides and reinforced with heavy timber, strong enough in many cases to survive a direct hit from American artillery. Fighting positions were connected by covered trenches, allowing defenders to shift from one position to another under fire without ever being exposed above ground. And crucially, these defensive belts were not arranged in a single line. They were staggered, one ring of bunkers behind another, so that a unit that fought its way through the first line of defense would find itself facing a second, freshly manned line almost immediately afterward, with no meaningful pause to reorganize or resupply in between. It is worth imagining, for a moment, what that labor actually required. Digging a fighting position deep enough and reinforced heavily enough to survive artillery fire by hand in ground laced with roots and stone is slow and exhausting work even without an enemy watching for the smoke of your cooking fires or the glint of a shovel blade. Doing it dozens of times over, across multiple rings of defense spread across several hills, while also keeping troops fed, supplied, and hidden from aerial observation, speaks to a level of organization and patience that stood in real tension with the popular American image, common at the time, of the North Vietnamese army as a loosely organized guerrilla force relying mainly on ambush and evasion. The bunkers on Hill 875 alone would prove, within days, to be the product of exactly that kind of patient, months-long preparation, not of a force improvising defenses on the fly. This was not improvisation. It reflected months of planning and labor by soldiers who expected, correctly, that American and South Vietnamese forces would eventually come looking for them in exactly this terrain. The 4 regiments of the 1st North Vietnamese Division, roughly 6,000 to 7,000 men in total, were not simply hiding in these mountains. They had built a fortress out of them, one hilltop and ridgeline at a time, and they had done it with enough advance warning that when the fighting finally began, it was the Americans, not the North Vietnamese, who would spend the first weeks of the battle discovering the shape of what they were up against, one costly assault at a time. It is worth remembering, too, that the North Vietnamese soldiers digging those positions were, in most respects, mirror images of the young Americans who would eventually assault them. Young men, often conscripted, far from home, fighting in terrain that, for many of them, was also unfamiliar, since the 1st Division had itself marched south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail from North Vietnam to reach this stretch of the Central Highlands. Whatever else separated the two sides of this coming battle, neither side was made up of men who had chosen this particular hillside as a place to fight and possibly die. Both sides had simply been sent there by decisions made far above either army's own foot soldiers. American and South Vietnamese units began moving into the hills around Dak To in the first days of November, still without a complete picture of the defensive network waiting for them. Patrols pushed out from the Special Forces camp and from newly established fire bases, probing the ridgelines above the town, looking for the enemy units Sergeant Vu Hong had described. They would not have to look for long. Within days, contact would come, and it would come hard, in a series of engagements across half a dozen different hills that, together, would grow into one of the largest and bloodiest battles fought by American forces in Vietnam up to that point in the war. On November 3rd and 4th, 1967, the first real contact of the battle began, as elements of the 4th Infantry Division's 3rd Battalion, 12th Infantry, and 3rd Battalion, 8th Infantry, ran into resistance on the ridgelines south of Dak To. The 173rd Airborne Brigade, newly arrived and moving into position alongside them, met similar resistance the following day. Neither contact on its own looked like the opening of a 3-week battle. That would become clear only gradually, hill by hill, over the days that followed. In the first days, before any of the fighting acquired the scale it would eventually reach, the pattern was familiar to anyone who had served in this kind of terrain before. Infantry companies pushing along ridgelines and through valley floors, engaging small groups of North Vietnamese soldiers in brief, sharp contacts, then losing contact again as the enemy withdrew deeper into the jungle, rather than standing and fighting a battle they were not yet ready to commit to fully. It was, in other words, still reconnaissance by both sides, each one trying to determine how large the other's actual force really was, before either side chose to commit its main strength to a single decisive engagement. On November 5th and 6th, Company B of the 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry, air assaulted onto a position called Hill 823, landing directly into resistance from the North Vietnamese 66th Regiment. An air assault of this kind carried its own particular danger, distinct from a ground advance. Helicopters descending into a landing zone whose defenses were not yet fully known, troops exposed in the open for the brief but critical seconds it took to disembark and reach cover, before the fight had even properly begun on the ground. The fighting continued through the night, close and confused in the darkness and the jungle, before the North Vietnamese finally withdrew before dawn, leaving more than 100 of their own dead behind on the hillside. It cost the Americans 9 killed and 28 wounded, a serious toll for a single hill, though one that would soon be dwarfed by what followed. Between these larger, named engagements sat a constant undercurrent of smaller contacts that rarely made it into any formal accounting of the battle at all. Brief exchanges of fire during routine patrols, single sniper rounds that sent a platoon diving for cover, nights spent listening to movement in the jungle just beyond a perimeter's claymore mines, without ever being certain whether it was the enemy, an animal, or simply the ordinary sound of a forest at night. For the individual soldier on the ground, this steady low-grade tension, far more than any single named battle, was often what the war actually felt like day to day, punctuated by occasional hours of the kind of intense, concentrated violence this documentary is describing in detail. The most costly single action of the battle's opening phase came on November 11th, when a task force from the 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry, built around Company C, and 2 platoons of Company D, walked into a prepared ambush laid by the North Vietnamese 8th and 9th Battalions of the 66th Regiment. The ambush struck at 8:28 in the morning, and it was not until relief columns fought their way through, arriving a little after 3:30 that afternoon, that the trapped Americans were freed. It was in the opening minutes of this same ambush, as described earlier in this documentary, that Private First Class John Barnes manned an abandoned machine gun and, in his final act, threw himself onto a grenade to save the wounded men gathered around him. The cost of the day's fighting for the task force as a whole came to 20 killed, 154 wounded, and 2 men listed as missing. The task force black ambush left behind something else worth recording here, a smaller and uglier story than the battle's larger casualty figures, but one that speaks directly to how difficult it is, even now, to know exactly what happened in a fight like this one. In the aftermath of the ambush, one company commander's initial count of enemy dead on the battlefield came to roughly 80 bodies. By the time that figure worked its way up the chain of command, it had been revised, on orders from above, to 175. According to one account from the fighting, when a lower-ranking officer challenged an even more inflated version of the count making its way into official reports, he was told simply that it was too late, the number had already been sent out. This documentary will return to the question of body counts and their reliability later, because Task Force Black was not the last time it came up during this battle. It is worth noting here, though, as an early and concrete example of a problem that would recur throughout. The pressure, at every level of command, to report a number that looked like a clear victory, whether or not it reflected what had actually happened on the ground. The fighting for Hill 823 also set a pattern that would repeat itself in one form or another across nearly every hill contested during the following 2 weeks. American troops moved in quickly by helicopter, landing directly into a defended position rather than approaching it gradually on foot, followed by close, disorienting combat in terrain where visibility rarely extended more than a few meters. It was a way of fighting that put a premium on individual courage and small unit cohesion, because there was often no possibility of seeing the wider shape of the battle from the ground, only the fight directly in front of whichever squad or platoon happened to be engaged at that moment. That same day, a separate engagement unfolded on a position called Hill 724, where the North Vietnamese 24th Regiment struck the 3rd Battalion, 8th Infantry, opening with a 30-minute mortar barrage before pressing forward with a ground assault. The fighting there cost 18 Americans killed and 118 wounded, against a claimed 92 North Vietnamese dead. It is worth noting, as this documentary moves toward the middle of the battle, that none of the fighting described so far had yet drawn the level of public attention that would eventually attach itself to Hill 875. Hill 823, Hill 724, the Task Force Black Ambush, each of these actions individually would have counted, in almost any other month of the war, as a significant engagement in its own right, worthy of its own extended news coverage. In the context of a single expanding battle that would keep growing for another 2 weeks, they instead became, in most retellings, simply the opening chapters of a larger story, a reminder of how much serious combat this single battle actually contained, compressed into barely 3 weeks of fighting in a stretch of mountains most Americans back home could not have located on a map. By the middle of November, then, before the fight for Hill 875 had even begun, the battle already carried a weight most single engagements of the war never approached. Multiple hills contested in bitter, close-range fighting, casualty counts climbing into the hundreds on the American side alone, and a growing recognition, up and down the chain of command, that whatever this was, it was not a routine sweep through contested territory. It was a battle the North Vietnamese army had prepared for, in some cases literally for months, and it was not close to finished. The middle stretch of the battle, from roughly the 15th through the 18th of November, brought a run of incidents that, taken together, show just how chaotic and dangerous the fighting around Dak To had become, for reasons that went well beyond direct combat with the enemy. By this point in the battle, the daily rhythm at Dak To's own airstrip had become something close to a small city's worth of continuous logistics, and an unusually exposed one. Transport aircraft cycled in and out constantly, ferrying ammunition, food, replacement troops, and fuel forward, while helicopters lifted off toward whichever hill needed resupply or medical evacuation that particular hour. All of that activity concentrated in one place made the airstrip itself an obvious and valuable target, one the North Vietnamese army did not ignore. On November 15th, during a routine refueling operation, mortar fire struck the airstrip at Dak To itself, destroying 2 C-130 transport aircraft and detonating the base's ammunition dump in the process. By some accounts, the resulting explosion, roughly 1,300 tons of ordnance and 17,000 gallons of fuel going up at once, may have been the single largest explosion of the entire Vietnam War. Remarkably, despite the scale of the blast, sources indicate no defenders were killed in the explosion itself, though the loss of ammunition and aircraft was a serious blow to a battle that was, by that point, consuming supplies at a punishing rate. That same day, a separate and much smaller tragedy unfolded during a road-clearing operation near the outpost at Ben Het, when Company D of the 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry, was struck by errant American artillery fire. 6 American soldiers were killed and 15 wounded, alongside 3 killed and 13 wounded among the Montagnard irregulars fighting beside them. This documentary wants to be precise about something here. This was a distinct friendly fire incident, separate from the far more consequential one that would strike the same battalion's sister unit 4 days later on Hill 875 itself. The two should not be confused with one another, even though both involve the same brigade within the same week, in the same stretch of mountains. These middle days of the battle also tested the resupply and logistics chain that connected every one of these scattered fights back to Dak To's own airstrip. Ammunition consumption at this rate of sustained combat far exceeded what planners had originally budgeted for the operation, and keeping every engaged unit supplied with enough rifle rounds, mortar shells, and artillery ammunition meant a continuous, exhausting cycle of transport flights, each one itself vulnerable to the same ground fire and difficult weather already described earlier in this documentary. From November 15th through the 19th, the 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry, fought its way through a fortified bunker complex on a position called Hill 882, a grinding close-quarters fight that cost 7 Americans killed and 34 wounded, against a claimed 51 North Vietnamese dead from the 66th Regiment. The fighting on Hill 882 is worth lingering on briefly, because it illustrates something about how these bunker complexes actually had to be cleared, position by position, rather than simply overrun in a single rush. Paratroopers moving through terrain like this often found themselves within a few meters of a bunker before they could even see it. Camouflaged as it was under logs and packed earth, its firing slit angled to cover the exact approach an attacking soldier would naturally take. Clearing one meant grenades thrown at close range, sometimes hand-to-hand contact at the bunker's entrance, and always the risk that a second, mutually supporting bunker nearby would open fire the moment the first one fell silent. Multiply that process across dozens of positions, spread over a week of continuous contact, and the accumulated toll of even a single hill, like 882, begins to make sense. Farther south, from November 18th through the 20th, South Vietnamese forces fought one of the hardest engagements of the entire battle, largely without American troops directly involved. The ARVN 3rd Battalion, 42nd Infantry, reinforced by elite ARVN airborne battalions, assaulted a heavily fortified North Vietnamese 24th Regiment position on Hill 1416. It took close, sustained combat to finally capture the position on the 20th, at a cost of 66 ARVN soldiers killed and 290 wounded, against a claimed 248 North Vietnamese dead. It is a measure of how large this battle had grown that an engagement this costly barely registers as a footnote in most popular accounts of Dak To, crowded out by the fight for Hill 875 that was, by that point, only days away. The ARVN units fighting on Hill 1416 deserve real acknowledgement in their own right, a fact many American-centered accounts of this battle tend to underplay. This was, by the casualty figures alone, one of the costliest single engagements of the entire 3-week battle, fought almost entirely by South Vietnamese soldiers against a heavily fortified position, using much the same close-quarters tactics American units were employing elsewhere on other hills, and paying a comparably steep price in doing so. The Battle for Dak To was never purely an American fight, however much popular memory of the war tends to center American units almost exclusively. South Vietnam's own army bled heavily across these same mountains, in the same 3 weeks, for the same broader strategic stakes. Around the same time, American forces also fought through a bunker complex on a hill numbered 1,338, a 2-day fight up steep, heavily defended slopes. This documentary wants to flag something important here, because it is easy to get wrong. This was not the first time American forces had fought on Hill 1,338 that year. 5 months earlier, in June of 1967, an entirely different and considerably more costly battle had been fought on that same terrain feature, a brutal ambush that cost the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, 79 killed and 23 wounded in a single engagement, one of the worst single losses the brigade suffered anywhere in Vietnam. These were 2 separate fights, 5 months apart, on the same hill, and this documentary is treating them as what they were, related only by geography, not by the same battle. It is worth noting, too, how little rest any of the units involved in these mid-battle engagements actually received. A company that fought through Hill 882 on the 18th might, within a day or two, find itself redirected toward an entirely different objective, with barely enough time to resupply ammunition and evacuate its own wounded before moving again. The battle did not pause to let any single unit recover fully before the next demand came in. By the time attention turned fully toward Hill 875, many of the paratroopers converging on it had already spent more than 2 weeks in nearly continuous contact with the enemy, exhausted in a way that rest alone, at that point, could no longer fully address. On November 18th, the pattern that had defined the battle so far, one contested hill after another, took its final and most consequential turn. A patrol from a Special Forces-led reconnaissance unit made contact near a modest, unremarkable-looking piece of high ground the maps recorded simply as Hill 875. Within a day, that contact would grow into the single costliest fight of the entire 3-week battle, and the name of that hill would come to define how this entire campaign was remembered. On the morning of November 19, 1967, 3 companies of the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, roughly 330 paratroopers in total, moved into position to assault Hill 875, 6 kilometers from the Cambodian border. Companies C and D led the formation, with 2 platoons from Company A following behind in reserve, an arrangement one historian later described as resembling something closer to First World War infantry tactics than the helicopter-borne warfare Vietnam is usually remembered for. 2 companies advancing together, 1 held back. Hill 875 itself was, in physical terms, an unremarkable-looking piece of terrain, one more forested ridge among dozens in the region, rising a few hundred meters above the surrounding valley floor. Nothing about its appearance from the air suggested the density of the defenses waiting beneath its canopy. That was, in a sense, exactly the point of how the North Vietnamese army had built its fortifications throughout this campaign. Ordinary-looking ground, concealing extraordinary preparation underneath it. At 9:43 that morning, the assault began climbing the slope. Every man in that formation carried a combat load that, in this terrain and this heat, was itself a significant burden before a single shot had been fired. Rifle and ammunition, water, rations, grenades, and whatever additional equipment his specific role in the company required, all of it carried uphill through jungle thick enough that the pace of the advance was governed as much by the vegetation as by any tactical decision. For the first hour, resistance was light enough that the advance continued largely unopposed. Then, at around 10:30, North Vietnamese machine gun fire opened up as the lead companies closed to within roughly 300 meters of the crest, the first sign that the hill was defended far more heavily than anyone in the American chain of command had anticipated. For the first hour after that initial machine gun fire, the fighting had the character of a contest. The Americans still believed they could win through sheer weight of firepower and forward momentum, artillery called in ahead of the advancing companies, air support standing by overhead, the ordinary rhythm of an American infantry assault in Vietnam. It was still, at that point, unclear to Captain Kaufman and the men under him just how large a force was actually dug in above them, waiting. The heaviest blow of the morning fell at around 2:30 that afternoon, when the North Vietnamese 2nd Battalion, 174th Regiment, launched a sudden, well-coordinated counterattack against Company A, the trailing element of the formation, catching the Americans from a direction that had not been fully covered. Company A was forced back down the slope under heavy fire. It was in the middle of this counterattack, as this documentary has already described, that Private First Class Carlos Lozada held his machine gun position alone to cover his company's withdrawal, buying the time that let the rest of the unit escape the slope at all. 6 American helicopters were damaged or destroyed that afternoon, attempting to resupply the increasingly desperate fighting below them. The damage done to the resupply helicopters that afternoon deserves a moment of its own attention, because it compounded everything else going wrong on the ground. A battalion fighting for its life on an exposed slope depends entirely on aircraft being able to reach it, bringing in ammunition, water, and reinforcements, and flying the most seriously wounded back out. When 6 helicopters were damaged or destroyed in a single afternoon attempting exactly that resupply run, it did not simply represent a loss of equipment. It meant fewer aircraft willing or able to risk the approach on subsequent runs, wounded men waiting longer for evacuation, and a battalion that was, hour by hour, growing more isolated from the support that any American unit in Vietnam ordinarily expected to have close at hand. By evening, the battalion was no longer advancing. It was surrounded, or close enough to it, that the distinction barely mattered, dug into whatever ground it could hold partway up the hill, taking fire from 3 sides, with wounded accumulating faster than they could be evacuated. It was into this deteriorating situation, at 6:58 that evening, that the single most consequential event of the entire battle took place. An American aircraft on a close air support run intended to hit North Vietnamese positions just beyond the American perimeter, instead dropped its bombs directly into the middle of the paratroopers' own lines. The best documented account identifies the aircraft as a Marine Corps A-4 Skyhawk, flown by Lieutenant Colonel Richard Tabor, an experienced Marine aviator with hundreds of logged combat missions to his name. This documentary should be honest that not every source agrees on this detail. A smaller number of accounts describe the aircraft instead as an Air Force F-100 or an F-4 Phantom, and this documentary was not able to fully resolve that discrepancy against a primary source before recording. The Skyhawk identification is the more specific and more independently corroborated version, and it is the one this documentary will use, but it should be understood as the best supported account, rather than a fully settled fact. Close air support in terrain like this depended on a chain of communication that had almost no room for error. A forward air controller or ground commander, radioing target coordinates upward, a pilot circling above a canopy so dense he could rarely see the ground troops directly, correlating those coordinates against a map and his own visual read of smoke markers or tree lines, and then committing to a bomb run at several hundred miles an hour with only seconds to correct course if something looked wrong. On a clear day, over open ground, that system worked as intended more often than not. Over a jungle-choked hillside at dusk, with American and North Vietnamese positions separated in places by less than the length of a football field, the margin for a fatal mistake narrowed to almost nothing. 2 500-pound bombs were released. one detonated as an airburst directly above the consolidated command post and aid station, the exact spot where the battalion's wounded, its medics, and the command groups of both forward companies had gathered together in the growing darkness. The most commonly cited figure for the casualties from this single incident is 42 killed and 45 wounded, a number that appears across the largest number of sources this documentary consulted, including detailed breakdowns of the battle as a whole. At least one other account, a Vietnam veterans publication, gives a considerably lower figure, closer to 20 killed and 20 to 30 wounded. This documentary cannot fully resolve that gap. What is not in dispute, across every source, is that the toll was severe, that it struck the battalion at its most vulnerable moment, gathered together and unable to disperse, and that among the dead was Chaplain Charles Waters, killed while tending to the wounded in exactly the spot the bombs found. Both the acting tactical commander on the ground, Captain Harold Kaufman, and the commander of Company D, Lieutenant O'Leary, were wounded in the same strike. This documentary found conflicting accounts of whether Kaufman himself survived the blast or was killed by it, and treats his fate here as unresolved rather than asserting one version over the other. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, the survivors faced a task almost as difficult as the fighting itself, sorting the living from the dead in near-total darkness, tending to wounds with medical supplies that had, in some cases, been destroyed in the same blast that caused them, and trying to re-establish some kind of coherent defensive perimeter around a command post that had just been effectively gutted. Radio operators worked to re-establish contact with higher headquarters, medics worked by feel and by flashlight, and every man still capable of holding a weapon understood that the enemy who had spent the day trying to overrun their position had not gone anywhere simply because an American bomb had just done some of that enemy's work for it. Night fell over Hill 875 with the battalion still clinging to a shattered perimeter partway up the slope, its own air support having struck it as hard as the enemy had, its chaplain dead, and its wounded still, in many cases, waiting to be evacuated from ground, the fighting made almost impossible to fly into. It would be 2 more days before relief reached them. The task of reaching the trapped battalion fell to the 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry, under Lieutenant Colonel James H. Johnson, ordered to fight its way up the same slope from a different direction. It was not a fast or an easy march. Sniper fire and mortar barrages harassed the column throughout the day on November 20th, and it was not until after nightfall that Johnson's men finally reached the survivors of the previous day's fighting, more than 24 hours after the bombs had fallen. Word of what had happened on Hill 875 the previous evening had, by the morning of the 20th, already begun moving up the chain of command, from the battalion to the brigade, from the brigade to the division, and beyond. For officers well removed from the fighting itself, the reports arriving that morning described a battalion badly mauled, its chaplain dead, dozens of its own men killed by their own side's air support, and still, as far as anyone could tell, surrounded. Decisions made in the hours that followed, about how much additional force to commit, how aggressively to press the relief effort, and how much risk to accept in doing so, were made against that grim backdrop, by commanders who understood exactly how badly the previous day had gone and were determined not to let it happen again. Consider what those trapped paratroopers experienced during that first night and the following day, before Johnson's relief column finally reached them. Their chaplain was dead. Dozens of their own men were wounded, some of them wounded twice over, first by the enemy and then by their own side's bombs. Resupply by air had grown more dangerous and less reliable with every passing hour, and the enemy holding the ground around them had shown no sign over the previous 24 hours of withdrawing or weakening. For a unit in that position, a single additional day of waiting for relief was not simply an inconvenience. It was another full day of exposure, another day of rationing, dwindling ammunition and water, Another day in which every hour that passed without reinforcement made the position that much more precarious. Reaching the battalion did not mean the hill was taken. The North Vietnamese defenders had not gone anywhere, and the combined American force, now 2 battalions strong on a single hillside, spent the following day, November 21st, attempting to push the rest of the way to the crest. In the afternoon fighting, some paratroopers briefly broke into the North Vietnamese trench line itself, close enough to see the fortifications from the inside, before being ordered to withdraw again as darkness approached, unwilling to hold isolated positions inside the enemy's own defenses overnight. For Lieutenant Colonel Johnson's own battalion, the relief force itself, the march to reach the trapped paratroopers, had not been a simple road march. Every step of that advance through the same jungle, up the same contested slope, carried its own risk of ambush, and Johnson's men fought their own smaller engagements along the route before ever reaching the men they had been sent to help. By the time the 2 battalions linked up on the evening of the 20th, both had already absorbed a full day of combat, meaning the combined force that spent the following 2 days trying to finish taking the hill was never, at any point, a fresh unit facing a tired enemy. It was 2 exhausted battalions facing an enemy that had, if anything, had more time to prepare its positions than either American unit had to plan its attack. That same period, a 3rd battalion, the 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry, part of the 4th Infantry Division, rather than the 173rd Airborne, was ordered to move overnight to a new position south of the hill, setting up a second line of attack that would let American forces press the position from 2 directions at once rather than 1. It was a sound tactical decision. It also produced, the following day, yet another friendly fire incident, the 3rd of the battle involving this same stretch of ground, and won. This documentary wants to describe carefully, so it is not mistaken for the far larger tragedy 2 days earlier. On November 22nd, as Delta Company of the 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry advanced roughly 50 to 75 meters from its helicopter landing zone, it was struck by rocket fire from American helicopter gunships, providing supporting fire overhead, fire that fell short of its intended target and landed, instead, on the advancing infantry. Accounts of the casualties differ slightly, ranging from 5 or 6 wounded by one officer's count to 6 or 7 named individually in another, but by every account, no one was killed in this particular incident, a smaller-scale echo of the same coordination failures that had already cost the battle so dearly 2 days before. Between the terrain, the jungle canopy, the smoke and confusion of continuous combat, and the sheer density of American and North Vietnamese forces occupying the same square kilometer of hillside, keeping air and ground forces reliably separated at Dak To had proven, again and again, to be one of the hardest problems of the entire battle, arguably harder in places than the fighting against the North Vietnamese army itself. For the wounded still being evacuated during these 2 days, the journey out was rarely simple, even once a helicopter finally managed to land. Litter teams carried men down slopes still under intermittent fire, often for considerable distances, before reaching a clearing wide enough and safe enough for an aircraft to touch down at all. Every one of those evacuations depended on a chain of exhausted men doing exactly the right thing under exactly the wrong conditions, again and again, for days on end, a less visible but no less essential form of courage than the fighting itself. Artillery and air support did not stop simply because the ground assault had paused for the night. Through the 21st and 22nd, American guns from fire bases across the region continued to pound the hillside around the clock, joined by repeated tactical airstrikes and, by some accounts, at least one strike from a B-52 bomber flying so high above the battlefield that the paratroopers below never saw or heard the aircraft itself, only felt the ground shake and watched a section of the distant tree line simply cease to exist. It was a form of warfare that operated on two entirely different scales at once. Infantrymen fighting hand-to-hand distances from an enemy they sometimes never saw clearly, while, high overhead, aircraft delivered ordnance that could erase an entire section of hillside in a single pass. By the close of November 22nd, two full American battalions ringed Hill 875 from multiple directions, backed by days of accumulated artillery fire and repeated airstrikes that had, by this point, stripped much of the hillside's vegetation away entirely, leaving the crest looking, by more than one account, like a moonscape rather than a jungle ridge. The North Vietnamese defenders inside their bunkers had endured all of it, and remained, as far as American command could tell, still dug in and still willing to fight for the ground. The next day would decide whether they would keep doing so. November 23, 1967, was Thanksgiving Day. This documentary wants to be clear that this is not a piece of after-the-fact storytelling dressing. The calendar confirms it plainly, and the men who fought that day knew exactly what date it was while they were doing it. For the men climbing that slope one final time, Thanksgiving carried a strange, doubled weight. Back home, in Massachusetts, in New Jersey, in Puerto Rico, in every state these paratroopers had come from, families were gathering around tables that morning, in the ordinary, familiar rhythm of the holiday. On the hillside itself, there was no turkey, no gathering, nothing resembling the holiday at all beyond the date on a calendar, and, for some of the men who had served together long enough to remember it, a grim, dark humor about the timing of what they were about to do. Several later accounts of the battle note that the men on the hill were acutely aware of the date, that some of them made quiet remarks about it in the hours before the final push, a small, human detail easy to lose inside the larger military narrative of unit numbers and casualty figures. The plan for the final assault was a pincer, two directions closing on the same summit at the same time. The 2nd and 4th Battalions, 503rd Infantry, would press upward from the position they had spent 4 days fighting to reach. The 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry, would attack from the south, jumping off at 10 o'clock that morning after days spent maneuvering into position and enduring their own friendly fire incident along the way. The scale of firepower directed at this single hill over the preceding 4 days is difficult to fully picture without some sense of comparison. Artillery batteries scattered across multiple fire bases had been firing on the position almost continuously since the 19th. Tactical aircraft had made repeated bombing and strafing runs against the same coordinates day after day, and at least one high-altitude strike from a B-52 bomber, a type of aircraft ordinarily associated with strategic bombing, rather than close support for a single infantry battalion, had been directed against the surrounding terrain as well. A hillside that had been thick, triple canopy jungle on the morning of the 19th was, by the morning of the 23rd, closer to bare, cratered earth. Both American battalions moved out that morning, knowing this attack was, in all likelihood, going to be the decisive one, whatever shape the fighting still took once the advance actually began. By the time the attack went in, days of continuous artillery fire and repeated airstrikes had already done something no infantry assault could have accomplished on its own. They had stripped the hillside almost entirely bare, burning away the jungle canopy that had hidden the North Vietnamese defenses so effectively on the battle's first day. What the paratroopers found climbing that final slope was very different from what had met them on November 19th. The bulk of the North Vietnamese 174th Regiment had withdrawn overnight, choosing to preserve what remained of its fighting strength, rather than hold a position that had been pounded for 5 straight days and was no longer defensible in any meaningful sense. What was left behind was a thin rear guard, and evidence of just how much punishment the position had absorbed, a scattering of charred bodies among the shattered bunkers, abandoned weapons and equipment left where they had fallen, a hilltop that looked, according to more than one account, less like a battlefield than the aftermath of a firestorm. For the survivors of the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry in particular, the men who had climbed this exact slope 5 days earlier and endured everything that followed, that final push must have carried an entirely different character from the confident, orderly advance of November 19th. They were climbing ground that had already cost them their chaplain, dozens of their friends, and days of continuous, exhausting combat, up a hillside that no longer even looked like the jungle it had been when they first set foot on it. Whatever the North Vietnamese rearguard still holding a handful of positions intended by staying behind, the battalion climbing toward them that morning was not the same battalion that had started this fight. The 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry's own attack from the south, moved quickly once it began. Delta Company reached the summit and linked up with the 173rd Airborne's positions at around 11:30 that morning, having suffered only a single wounded soldier in the final push, a strikingly light cost compared to everything that had come before it, a reflection of just how much the days of preparatory fire had already broken the will and the capacity of the defenders still on the hill. Word that the hill had finally fallen spread quickly through the rest of the units, still fighting elsewhere across the broader Dak To battle, a small piece of good news arriving on a holiday that, for most of the men involved, had otherwise passed entirely unmarked by anything resembling celebration. For the exhausted battalions still holding positions on other contested hills nearby, the fall of Hill 875 offered no immediate relief of their own. The wider battle continued for several more days after the 23rd, even as the single most costly action within it had, at last, come to its end. By early afternoon, Hill 875 was, for the first time in 5 days, entirely in American and South Vietnamese hands. One account of the fighting describes it simply as a nightmarish Thanksgiving Day confrontation, a description that does not feel like exaggeration once the numbers are laid out plainly. Some later accounts describe the fight as having lasted, start to finish, roughly 110 hours, not quite 5 full days, from the first contact on November 18th to the final link-up on the 23rd. The cost, tallied specifically for Hill 875 and kept separate from the wider battle's own casualty figures, came to this. The 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, lost 87 men killed, 130 wounded, and 3 missing. The 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry, lost 28 killed, 123 wounded, and 4 missing. Combined, the fight for a single hill cost roughly 115 Americans killed, something in the neighborhood of 253 wounded, and 7 men still listed as missing when the fighting finally stopped. It amounted to, by one calculation, close to 1/5 of the entire 173rd Airborne Brigade's authorized strength spent taking a single ridgeline that, as this documentary will discuss shortly, one of the generals who came after this battle would later describe as having no lasting strategic value at all. For now, on the afternoon of November 23, 1967, none of that later judgment had been rendered yet. What the exhausted paratroopers standing on the summit of Hill 875 knew was simpler and more immediate. The hill was theirs. The fighting on this particular piece of ground was over, and it was Thanksgiving. Before turning to those wider numbers, it is worth stating plainly what this documentary has already shown you in detail about how difficult it is to trust any single figure from this battle without real scrutiny. This documentary has already walked through a body count inflated from roughly 80 to 175 at Task Force Black, a friendly fire casualty count that varies by more than half depending on the source consulted, and a friendly fire aircraft identification that cannot be fully confirmed with certainty. Keep all of that in mind as this documentary now turns to the battle's largest, most consequential numbers, the ones that attempt to summarize what the entire 3 weeks actually cost. Zoomed out to the whole 3-week battle, not just the single hill this documentary has spent the last half hour describing, the numbers grow considerably larger and considerably harder to pin down with confidence. For the full Battle of Dak To, from November 3rd through the 23rd, American forces suffered roughly 376 killed or missing and presumed dead, alongside 1,441 wounded. South Vietnam's own army lost 73 killed, 18 missing, and 290 wounded. The 173rd Airborne Brigade alone, across the entire battle, rather than just the fight for Hill 875, is credited in some accounts with 208 killed and 645 wounded out of roughly 3,200 paratroopers committed, a casualty rate approaching 27% of the entire brigade. Equipment losses ran to roughly 40 helicopters destroyed or damaged beyond repair, 2 C-130 transport aircraft, and at least 1 F-4 Phantom fighter. The scale of firepower expended to support the battle was, by any measure, enormous. More than 170,000 artillery rounds fired, something over 2,000 tactical airstrikes flown, and, depending on the source, somewhere between 250 and 300 individual B-52 bomber sorties directed against the surrounding terrain. What is far less settled is how many North Vietnamese soldiers actually died in this battle, and this documentary wants to walk through that uncertainty honestly, rather than simply repeating one number as though it were fact. American Command's official count for the entire battle ran as high as 1,644 confirmed dead, drawn from body counts across the 4 North Vietnamese regiments engaged. Other American figures from the time cited a lower total, closer to 1,227. And at least one senior American general involved in the fighting, Major General William Rawson, is on record expressing skepticism about even these lower figures, estimating privately that the real total was probably closer to 1,000. On the other side of the ledger entirely, North Vietnamese and contemporary Associated Press reporting of Hanoi's own claims put American and South Vietnamese losses at something in the range of 2,800 American and 700 South Vietnamese dead, a figure wildly higher than anything the American side ever claimed for its own casualties. Both sides, in other words, were inflating the other side's losses considerably, and this documentary already gave you one specific, well-documented example of exactly how that inflation happened on the American side. The task force black body count that grew from roughly 80 confirmed dead to 175 reported dead, apparently simply because the higher number had already been sent up the chain before anyone thought to correct it. It is worth pausing on why body counts mattered so much to the American command structure in the first place, because the practice and its problems ran through this entire war rather than being specific to Dak To alone. Unlike a conventional war fought over territory, where progress could be measured in towns captured or ground held, American strategy in Vietnam largely measured success through attrition. How many enemy soldiers were killed relative to how many were being replaced? That measurement placed enormous pressure on every officer up and down the chain of command to report enemy losses as high as the evidence, however thin, could plausibly support, because a high body count was, within that framework, the only available proof that a costly engagement had actually accomplished something. The Task Force Black incident, where a count of roughly 80 became a reported figure of 175, was not an isolated failure of individual honesty. It was closer to a predictable consequence of building an entire war's measurement of success around a number that was, by its nature, almost impossible to verify with real precision on a jungle battlefield where the enemy routinely carried its own dead away before American troops could count them. A senior Marine Corps general watching the battle from a distance John Chaisson, offered what may be the sharpest contemporary summary of the arithmetic problem at the heart of all these disputed numbers. "Is it a victory," he asked, "when you lose 362 of your own men in 3 weeks, and by your own admittedly questionable body count, only manage to claim 1,200 of the enemy in return?" It is worth noting that even Chaisson's own framing of the question relied on a body count he himself was implicitly casting doubt on, which tells you something about how deep the uncertainty ran, even among the officers responsible for reporting these numbers upward. It is worth remembering that these casualty figures, whatever their exact final tally, do not exist only as numbers in a historical accounting. Each one represents a telegram delivered to a family somewhere in the United States, a folded flag, a name eventually etched into a black granite wall in Washington that would not be dedicated for another 15 years. The uncertainty in the exact totals this documentary has walked through should not be mistaken for uncertainty about the scale of what this battle actually cost in human terms. Whether the true figure for American dead across the whole battle was 362 or 376, it was, either way, hundreds of families receiving the worst possible news in the final weeks of 1967, many of them, just as the rest of the country, was sitting down to its own Thanksgiving tables. General William Westmoreland, commanding all American forces in Vietnam, declared Dak to the beginning of a great defeat for Hanoi, and claimed that 3 of the 4 North Vietnamese regiments engaged had been rendered combat ineffective, with only the 24th Regiment judged capable of fighting again in the near future. 10 weeks later, the countrywide Tet Offensive began, and the 24th Regiment Westmoreland had specifically flagged as still combat capable took part in it. Whether that means Dak To was, in fact, the clear tactical victory Westmoreland described, one that simply failed to prevent a larger offensive it was never designed to stop, or whether it means the North Vietnamese force at Dak To achieved exactly what it needed to achieve regardless of its own casualties, remains a genuinely open question among historians who have studied the battle since. This documentary is not going to resolve it for you. Both readings appear, in good faith, in the serious literature on this battle, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. What is less ambiguous is the judgment offered years later by the general who succeeded William Peers in command of the 4th Infantry Division. Major General Charles Stone, in a later interview, described his own difficulty even locating Hill 875 on a map when he arrived to take command, and did not hold back his assessment of what had been fought over. "The Highland operations," he said bluntly, "were stupid." Hill 875 itself, he continued, had absolutely no importance in the war afterward, no strategic value at all. Ground the North Vietnamese army held not because it contained anything worth holding, but because holding remote mountains along the border cost them nothing, since there were no people and no resources there to protect in the first place. It is a striking thing to hear a general say about ground more than 100 of his own army's paratroopers had just died taking. It is worth weighing General Stone's blunt later assessment against the counter-argument raised earlier in this documentary, because a fair accounting has to hold both in mind at once. If the North Vietnamese objective at Dak To really was, at least in part, to draw American combat power away from the population centers ahead of Tet, then the ground itself may genuinely have had no lasting value to either side, exactly as Stone argued, while the battle fought over it still accomplished something real for whichever side benefited more from where those American battalions were standing in late January of 1968. Judged purely as a contest over terrain, Stone's verdict is hard to argue with. Nothing of consequence happened on Hill 875 afterward. Judged as a diversion, if that is in fact what it was, the terrain's value was never really the point in the first place. It is worth asking what better intelligence might have actually changed had it been available before the 19th. A clearer picture of the 174th Regiment's strength and positioning might have led to a larger initial assault force, a different approach route, or heavier preparatory fire before any American troops set foot on the slope at all. None of that is certain. What is reasonably certain is that the 3 companies who began that climb on the morning of November 19th did so without the kind of detailed picture of what they were about to face that later after-action analysis would eventually assemble, and that the eventual reserve force counterattack that struck Company A that afternoon came as a genuine surprise to the men on the ground, not a contingency they had been specifically briefed to expect. There is a further, more specific criticism worth including here. By at least one account of the planning behind the November 19th assault, Brigadier General Schweiter and his staff had no real intelligence on how heavily fortified the North Vietnamese trench and bunker network on Hill 875 actually was before committing 3 companies to climb it. The assault went in without a clear picture of what it was walking into, and was then struck by a reserve force whose presence had not been anticipated at all. This documentary did not find any record of a formal military court of inquiry or investigation opened into either that intelligence failure or the friendly firebombing that followed it later that same day. It should be said plainly that finding no record of an investigation is not the same thing as confirming that none occurred. It is simply what the available sources show, or rather, what they do not show. This documentary should also note that not every officer who served in this battle shared General Stone's later, harsher assessment. Brigadier General Schweiter and other commanders directly involved defended the decision to take the hill at the time, and continued, in later years, to point to the casualties inflicted on the North Vietnamese 174th Regiment as evidence that the fight had achieved something real, whatever its long-term strategic value turned out to be. This documentary is presenting Stone's criticism because it is specific, well-documented, and comes from someone who inherited direct responsibility for this same stretch of terrain shortly afterward, not because it represents the only view held by the men who were actually there. Contemporary press coverage was skeptical in its own way as well. Associated Press correspondent Peter Arnett filed detailed on-the-ground reporting from Hill 875 in the days after the battle, coverage that did not simply repeat the official framing of a clear-cut victory. One line from the period, quoted in a veteran's publication years later, captures the mood among some observers at the time more bluntly than any general's later assessment. With victories like this, the line went, "Who needs defeats?" There is a further irony worth returning to here, one this documentary raised only briefly earlier and now wants to close the loop on. Major General William Pears, who commanded the 4th Infantry Division during this battle and who publicly praised it as a clear American victory, would be appointed 2 years later, in November of 1969, to lead the official Army investigation into the cover-up surrounding the My Lai massacre, an atrocity committed by soldiers in a different division entirely, in a different part of the country. The two events are not connected by cause or by unit lineage, but they are connected by the same uncomfortable pattern this documentary has already traced through Dak To itself. Official military reporting in 1967 and for years afterward that did not always match what had actually happened on the ground, and a war in which the gap between the official record and the underlying reality had, by the time Pears was asked to investigate that gap directly at My Lai, already become one of its defining and most corrosive features. Historian John Prados, writing later about the broader campaign along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, characterized Dak To as one of the bloodiest battles of the entire American war in South Vietnam, and specifically noted the layered nature of the North Vietnamese defenses, positioned one behind another at intervals of a kilometer or more, exactly the kind of defense in depth that made every advance costly, regardless of how many individual positions were eventually taken. It is, on reflection, a fitting summary of the entire three-week battle. Ground taken, ground held, at a cost that even the men who won it would later struggle to justify. Time has continued to take its own toll on the veterans of this battle, quietly and separately from anything this documentary has already described. The men who survived Hill 875 and the wider fighting at Dak To are, more than half a century later, in their late 70s and 80s, and the community of first-hand witnesses able to speak to what actually happened on that hillside grows smaller with each passing year, which is part of why the written record, the after-action reports, and the veteran interviews collected in books like Murphy's has become steadily more valuable and more irreplaceable as time goes on. In the decades since November of 1967, the men who survived Dak To and Hill 875 have done a great deal of the work of remembering it themselves, in ways that outside institutions never fully matched. Each of the three men this documentary opened with has, in his own way, been folded permanently into that same larger memorial landscape. Waters remembered on the chaplain's own honor roll, and in the New Jersey communities that raised him. Lozada remembered in the Bronx and in San Juan. Barnes remembered in the Massachusetts town that watched him grow up. The 173rd Airborne Brigade Association, known informally among its members as the Sky Soldiers, remains an active organization today, connecting veterans of the brigade across every conflict it has served in since Vietnam. In 2010, the brigade dedicated a permanent memorial at Patriot Park, adjacent to the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning, Georgia, honoring more than 1,700 Sky Soldiers killed across Vietnam, and in the decades since, Afghanistan and Iraq as well. The memorial includes a dedicated gallery honoring the brigade's own Medal of Honor recipients, a list that includes Charles Waters, Carlos Lozada, and John Barnes, the three men whose stories opened this documentary, alongside others earned in different battles across the brigade's long history. The Airborne and Special Operations Museum at Fort Bragg has, at various points, run its own dedicated exhibit on the 173rd's history as well, tracing the brigade's story from its Vietnam service forward. Unlike some battles of this scale, Dak To was extensively covered by journalists on the ground even as it happened, and that contemporary reporting has become, in its own right, part of how the battle survives in the historical record. Wire service photographers and correspondents filed dispatches and images from the fighting throughout November of 1967, material that today sits alongside the official after-action reports as one of the primary windows into what the battle actually looked and felt like to the people living through it, rather than only how it was summarized afterward by historians working from a distance. The most complete single account of the battle exists in book form. Edward Murphy's Dak To, published in 1993, built from extensive research and veteran interviews, and praised at the time for combining meticulous historical research with a narrative pace closer to a novel than a typical military history. A more specialized, narrower military study, a paper written by Leonard Scott for the Army War College in 1988, focuses specifically and in considerable tactical detail on the fight for Hill 875 itself, drawing on after-action reports and first-hand interviews with the men who fought there. Historian Shelby Stanton covered the battle as part of his broader history of the American Ground War, and John Prados, writing about the Ho Chi Minh Trail more broadly, gave the battle its own extended assessment as well. A television documentary, an episode titled Combat Zone, Hill 875, released in 2007, brought some of this material to a wider audience, and archival combat footage from the battle continues to circulate today, a reminder that this fight, unlike some others of the war, was extensively filmed and photographed even as it was happening. A more specialized, narrower military study, a paper written for the Army War College in 1988, focuses specifically and in considerable tactical detail on the fight for Hill 875 itself, drawing on after-action reports and first-hand interviews with the men who fought there, the kind of granular unit-level material that a broader popular history necessarily has to compress or leave out. Between the popular narrative history, the specialized military study, and the contemporary press coverage, the raw material for understanding this battle in real depth has never actually been scarce. What has been scarce, by comparison to battles like Ia Drang or Khe Sanh, is public attention finding its way to that material in the first place. And yet, for all of that documentation, Dak To and Hill 875 occupy a strange position in how the Vietnam War is popularly remembered. Ask most people to name a major battle of the war, and the answers that come back tend to be the same handful: Ia Drang, Khe Sanh, Hue, Hamburger Hill. Hill 875 rarely makes that list, despite one description of it, appearing in more than one source independently, as among the most costly single pieces of terrain ever taken by American forces in the entire war. It is, in a real sense, the quiet, overlooked companion to those more famous battles, comparable in cost, comparable in intensity, fought by men who showed exactly the same courage and paid exactly the same price, and somehow left mostly outside the short list of names most people carry around in their heads when they picture that war. There is a specific comparison worth drawing out here. The Battle of Ia Drang, fought 2 years earlier in 1965, has become, through books and film, one of the most widely recognized single engagements of the entire war, taught in military academies and referenced constantly in popular culture. Dak To fought over a comparable span of casualties, arguably against more heavily fortified defenses, involving a comparable number of American units, has never received anything close to the same cultural weight. Part of that gap likely comes down to timing and competition for attention. Dak To was quickly overshadowed first by Khe Sanh's much longer and more dramatic siege, and then, within months, by the countrywide shock of Tet itself, two enormous stories that left comparatively little room in the public imagination for a 3-week battle that had already concluded by the time either of them fully unfolded. That is, in its own way, exactly the kind of story this documentary exists to tell. Not to argue that Hill 875 was more important than the battles that became famous, but simply to make sure it is not forgotten, because it happened to be one battle too many in a year that had already produced Khe Sanh and would soon produce Tet. There is a final thread worth pulling gently before this documentary closes, connecting all the way back to the bunkers described earlier in this story. The North Vietnamese soldiers who held Hill 875 and the other hills contested across this same battle have their own remembrance of these 3 weeks as well, distinct from and largely separate from the American and South Vietnamese accounts this documentary has drawn from. Vietnamese language histories of the war record this same fighting from the other side of the wire, honoring their own dead in their own way, a reminder that every battle this channel covers was, without exception, experienced by two sides at once, even when the sources available to tell that story in English remain, as they do here, considerably thinner than the American record. What this documentary hopes you carry away from the last 2 hours is not, in the end, a set of casualty figures or unit designations, however carefully those have been laid out. It is the shape of 3 specific lives, and how each of them ended on the same stretch of jungle within days of each other. A parish priest who could have gone home and chose 6 more months in a war zone instead, and spent the last hours of his life carrying wounded men on his own shoulders. A young husband from the mountains of Puerto Rico who held a machine gun alone at the edge of a collapsing line because it was the only way anyone else was getting off that hill. A quiet, patriotic young man from Massachusetts who had already served his country once came back for a second tour anyway, and in his final moment made a choice his own commanding officer initially couldn't bring himself to honor with a medal. None of them knew, in November of 1967, how the larger battle around them would eventually be judged, whether historians decades later would call it a costly but real American victory or a battle over ground with no lasting value at all. That argument belonged to the generals and the historians who came after. What belonged to Charles Waters and Carlos Lozada and John Barnes on the days that mattered was simply the choice in front of them, made in the middle of a fight none of them had started and few of them fully understood, and made, in each case, in favor of the men standing next to them rather than themselves. That is what remains, more than half a century later, on a hillside in the central highlands of Vietnam that most people have never heard of, and that this documentary hopes, for the length of one evening at least, you will not forget again.